Yes, you can come right up. I'm your coordinator and moderator, Dr. Emily Stacy. I'm a professor of political science here at Rose State College, and I'm so thrilled to see all of you guys show up, and not just my students who I coerced, right? It's wonderful to see so many stakeholders, faculty members, staff, my exec team, everybody here to support this very important conversation. So before I introduce our present esteemed panelist, I want to thank just a couple of folks, Dr. Anita Poole-Inslee and her wonderful team, Connie Myrick, and their team for putting all of this beautiful, location together, the tables and the setup, et cetera, and of course the catering team as well. Students getting a free meal is always wonderful. James Davenport the Younger, our technician and camera person back there, we appreciate him greatly. My division leadership, Dean Tony Castillo, who's been extremely supportive in giving me so much autonomy in planning this event, as well as my associate dean, James Davenport, who is my political science partner in crime. So we are usually doing these type of events together. You probably have seen us on our podcast, et cetera. So I don't do a whole lot without James. Again, I would like to thank the faculty and executive team colleagues who did join us today, supporting this conversation and taking the time to promote the event to your friends and family, et cetera. And so welcome. We want to welcome you to our beautiful new student union and the First National Bank ballroom for this debate. So our panel's credentials, and these two as well, right? Our panel's credentials are extremely impressive. We're really, really lucky to have these folks on campus to enlighten us regarding this important Supreme Court decision. So to my right is Dr. Despain, Matthew Despain. He's a professor of history and the director of our Native American Studies program. So before joining the Rose State faculty, Dr. Despain taught at the University of Oklahoma in both the Native American Studies program and in the Department of History. His teaching interests cover both Native American Studies and history disciplines, including courses in the American West, American Indian history, Native American philosophy, federal Indian policy, sovereignty. He does everything. He does absolutely everything. He has published and was the founding editor of the Native Matters, the Journal of Native American Studies, published by the University of Oklahoma, and the former editor of the Chickasaw Nation's Journal of Chickasaw History and Culture. He works for the Museum of the Mountain Man, I didn't know that about you, and the Journal of Rocky Mountain Fur Trade. His own publications include Fur Trappers and Traders of the Far Southwest, and numerous articles on Native American history, culture, the American West, the American fur trade, Oklahoma history, and American popular culture topics. He will also not tell you guys that he is a prolific bagpipe player. So if you ever come to campus and randomly hear bagpipes, it is Dr. Despain rapturing us with his lovely music. To his right is Mr. Chris Griswold. He is a father, a commercial business attorney, a professor, a broker, a mentor, a book author of 4 different genres, an investor, speaker, guest columnist of 60 plus articles, frequent community volunteer, and writer of a monthly e-newsletter, which has roughly 30,000 organically grown subscribers. We love grassroots. So Chris is a professor who teaches real estate and business law courses at the University of Central Oklahoma and stays closely connected to his students even after they graduate. I'm one of those, they text me all the time. So Chris is a proud graduate from Texas Tech University in Lubbock, Texas, which we will not hold against him, where he obtained a bachelor's in 1996. Then he attended the Oklahoma University of College Law in Norman, Oklahoma, of course, and obtained his Juris Doctorate in 1999. He was also worked on the law review at the University of Oklahoma College of Law. He and a partner, Gina, Timberman, thank you, both interned together at the Bureau of Indian Affairs at the Department of Justice in Washington, D.C. back in 1999 during the impeachment hearing, so he's got some stories. And interestingly, had the joint privilege and honor of filling the seminal landmark Corbell Indian law case as interns. That's amazing. So they both now continue to work on and speak on Indian law issues and tribal investment strategy and related matters. And then we have Ms. Angel Ellis. Thank you for being here. I'm sorry about the rain.
That's okay. I'm running on Indian time too, so
we're glad to have you. Ms. Angel Ellis is a citizen of the Muskogee Creek Nation and has worked in journalism for 13 years. She specifically covered Indigenous topics and those related to the Muskogee Nation for about 7 years. working for Muskogee Media. On September 18th, the Muskogee Nation actually became the first tribe in the United States to have a citizen-ratified constitutional amendment protecting free press rights. That's a big, big deal for the state. So please welcome our panelists who are here with us at the moment. We're very excited to have you. So as you guys know, it's been a little bit more than a year since the Supreme Court's landmark McGirt versus Oklahoma decision maintained that Oklahoma, or the state of Oklahoma, does not have the jurisdiction to pursue cases against American Indians for crimes allegedly committed on tribal land. So according to Justice Neil Gorsuch, writing for the 5-4 majority, 3.25 million acres of Oklahoma, including much of Tulsa, remain Muskogee Creek Nation land. So state courts have since recognized Cherokee, Choctaw, Chickasaw, and Seminole reservations covering most of the eastern half of our state. So Muskogee land in Oklahoma was established by a treaty with the United States government back in 1866. So 4 decades before Oklahoma actually achieved its statehood. So in that treaty, the federal government promised that the land would, quote, be forever set apart as a home for said Creek Nation. End quote. Because Congress never explicitly de-established the Muskogee Reservation in Oklahoma, it still exists, the High Court found. So the Major Crimes Act of 1885 then gave the federal government jurisdiction over certain serious crimes alleged to have been committed by Native Americans on tribal land. So in 1997, the state of Oklahoma convicted Jim C. McGirt, who is the namesake of this case, of sex crimes included in the Major Crimes Act. So he was sentenced to 2 consecutive 500-year sentences, and the ruling came out of the McGirt decision, challenging the convictions. Again, says that because the crime occurred on Muskogee Nation reservation territory, that the state of Oklahoma did not have the authority to prosecute him. So the state did vacate McGirt's convictions, but of course the United States Court for the Eastern District subsequently charged him with the crimes that led to his previous convictions. So the U.S. Attorney's Office for the Eastern District of Oklahoma announced on August 25th, 2021, that McGirt was sentenced to life imprisonment and 5 years of supervised release for the 2 counts of aggravated sexual abuse in Indian country. So just a few weeks before the federal sentencing of McGirt, the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals on August 12th found that the McGirt ruling does not apply retroactively, meaning that Oklahoma inmates who thought they may get a new trial based on the McGirt decision may remain in prison, some on death row. So there are a whole lot of implications, obviously, to this case to discuss, but that's what this panel is for. I just wanted to set you guys up with where we are. So with that, I will ask my first question to the panelists. So what is the historical significance of the McGirt decision? How has the July 2020 Supreme Court decision changed the composition of the state of Oklahoma and its land resources? We will just go down the line, Dr. Despain.
I get it. Okay. But you're asking about the historical foundation for this, right?
Sure.
So, I mean, I think central to this, and I'm talking more from an academic perspective, but I think the foundation is that we've got to understand is that everything is predicated upon a treaty or multiple treaties. And using this forum right now as again, the professor and me coming out is, what is a treaty? And a treaty is merely a contract between nations, right? And so we've had a plethora of these treaties through the United States, some of them proceeding into the British era, but these treaties have recognized that a myriad of tribes are nations, putting them on the same status, if we want to think about of France and England and other things. Now, we've went ahead and readjusted those with various decisions through the Supreme Court, but nevertheless, they established that precedence that we have nations. I think this is one of the struggles that we see in America overall. We can, I think, see it in some of the goings on here in our state is a lack of understanding what those treaties are and what they mean and how they've defined our tribal societies, our tribal nations. That's what they're called, nations, right? And that we also have to understand that within that, and I hope I'm not backing up too much, but in some very important cases that came out of the John Marshall Court, we have defined those native groups right, as first out of the Cherokee versus Georgia decision as domestic dependent nations. Now, that instills a sense of what we'll call semi-sovereign status, right? Not full sovereign like the federal government, but a semi-sovereign status equal unto the states. Because his next decision, which came with Worcester versus Georgia, outlined that and said that no state shall have supremacy over these tribal nations. I'm paraphrasing, but that only the federal government, and that harkens back to the Constitution anyway. The Constitution says Congress has jurisdiction over these affairs, right? Not states. And so that's what we're struggling with here, is having an administration that is struggling themselves to basically understand the very elemental aspects of federal Indian law. So that's kind of the early foundation. And then when it comes more specific to the Creeks, of course, we have the removal treaty of 33, even one prior in Washington in 32. But in those treaties, it was, as the wordage is, that there shall be a home, a permanent home, right? That's the word, or words, permanent home established for the Creek in the West after they're being removed out of all the, escaping the atrocities of that Southern society, taking their lands, engaging in ethnocide and genocide and things of this nature. They found a refuge here, but it was done so that they would have that permanent home. And within that treaty, right, it even said that the Creeks shall have full jurisdiction over their enrolled members and over their property. And therefore, this treaty recognizes Creek sovereignty. It recognizes Creek nationhood. Then you go a little bit further on after the removal and the Creek tribe coming here, in that you have this formal patent, if we want to think of it in that treaty approach, that we have now a Creek nation, fully defined that way, that they have control over that land. But there's a key word in that, and this comes, I think, to the McGirt decision. Key word in there is that these lands were reserved. Okay, that hints back to the reservation. These are reserved. It's their lands, and does it fit within Indian territory? Anyway, that sets the foundation. Now we could move on into the Reconstruction treaties, right, that come after the Civil War, when the Creek and the Seminole are forced to allocate, right, forced by the federal government to allocate portions of their reservation, which actually extended onto the lands of Rose State. The Canadian River to the south, and actually to the North Canadian with the Seminole, that was part of their lands that extended to the Mexican territories, right? That was the original treaties. And of course, going all the way up, I think it was the Cimarron or up to the Cherokee Outlet. But that was the Creek domain. Again, went all the way to what was then Mexican territory. You and I, therefore, our institution, this place of gathering, was once the lands of the Creek and the Seminole, and prior to that, the Comanche, the Osage, the Kiowa, the Plains Apache, the Tonkawa. I can keep going, right? And so we have to understand that part of what we're dealing with here is these issues over land, right? And we're specifically focusing on the Creek, but that we should, I think, in a way, recognize that the lands upon which we are educated, which we gather here, were indigenous lands, right? Now, why is that important? Because we need to rebalance the history. We need to understand what the history of Oklahoma is. And it is a history that is not just a boomer and sooner history, but one that precedes time immemorial in terms of an indigenous place. If we can do that, if we can start to understand these other aspects of our history, then things like these debates over McGirt are almost moot, because we have a better understanding of our nation, of its history, of the legalities, of the treaties, of all of that. And so, but it's taking us to McGirt to kind of bring us to this forum to have these kind of discussions, to iron out just the truths, the simple truths. So I don't know if I've set this up in a good way. I kind of, me, I get going.
I think
right?
Mr. Griswold.
But at this point, I'm going to go ahead and turn to my right.
Well, thank you so much. Hopefully y'all can hear me. Am I coming through? Thanks for having me. I'm Chris. When you talk about glaciers, you're talking about something that sticks a little bit above water, like 10% above water that you can see, like what sank the Titanic. Then there's the 90% below the watermark. Can y'all still hear me well? this is kind of the same thing. As much as we're talking about McGirt, the state of Oklahoma, our current governor, the beloved Ginsburg, who's now departed, and a lot of other things that are very concurrent and contemporary that you can identify with. We're talking about stuff that's a lot bigger than just this. What this is a huge body of constitutional law that's developed over 150, 200 years. And in McGirt, the Supreme Court simply reaffirmed what the law was. There'd been a reservation since 1866. It's been here all along. It's still there. Just because it's Tulsa and the surrounding 12 or 13 counties that surround it are included in the Muskogee Nation doesn't blow up the world. It's not something that you can politically spin on social media. And that's kind of what the debate is. What you're hearing about is what you know, and what you know is what you read in the papers or seen on social media, which has very little to do with anything that relates to constitutional law or a very well-established body of Indian law. And so what the court did was they said, hey, we re-recognize a reservation that's been there since 1866, the Treaty of 1866, and tribal sovereignty exists. I haven't seen anybody putting up fences around Tulsa and the surrounding counties to mark it off as the Muskogee Nation. It's there, and it's fully integratable into the rest of the lands and the properties which constitute the state of Oklahoma. But it is important to note that this decision, while it does, and you hear people argue a lot of different ways and out of both sides of their mouth, they try to take something that works for them, and when it works against them, they try to deny it or spin it. But what you're talking about is Muskogee Nation. There's tribal sovereignty there that is exercised. There is concurrent authority between tribal sovereignty and the other sovereignty, which is the federal government and the state. And it's a mix. It's like three circles that all intersect in a certain place. And the tribes now have options and rights to do what they should have been doing all along. So it was a real win for them. But we're not talking about Indian law. We're not talking, and I say this all from, I'm a business lawyer. I do commercial deals. I advise people that are not huge tribes, and they're not the tribe's biggest enemies. On either side of the aisle, these are just business people, bankers, business owners, commercial real estate developers that are trying to make decisions, informed decisions, intelligent ones that surround the ins and outs of this. And so I'd like to think that as much as anybody could be, I'm as objective as I can be. When I say to you that there's a lot of great things that can come out of this, but we have to recognize those, and we can't fight over it. We can't politically spin on social media truths or fables and myths and urban legends around something that is, whether you want to know a lot about it or a little bit about it, constitutional law. And it happens to be a win for everybody if we can recognize it as that.
All right. So historical significance. I think that you guys did a great job of quoting the treaties and the dates and all that. But like, what I really think the significance of this case is that for the first time ever, and because it's never been easy for other people to understand the historical progression of tribes, the rest of the world is being forced to understand it in a way, because we have to look to these treaties and we have to look to these court cases. Because when we read historical, even history books, like how many of you grew up with the Sooner, story, and you know what that is, but how many of you really understood that what was happening was indigenous land was being stolen? That isn't really written in those books, because always the dominant and prevailing entity is going to write that story for you. So now people are pulling out these cases, they're pulling out these treaties, and it's probably the first time that anyone's ever heard on such a magnified level the actual real history of what's been going on. They've finally been able to understand that these nations were here long before the state of Oklahoma ever existed. They've finally been able to understand that a complex and very adequate legal system was in place before. It just always never jived right within those three overlapping circles, and so a dominant and prevailing society took over. So what you're seeing play out in the media and what you're seeing play out on your 5 o'clock news is finally, for the first time, you're seeing that battle between the sovereignty, the sovereignty of the state of Oklahoma, the sovereignty of the nations, but you're seeing it play out instead of on battlefields and instead of by making people walk the Trail of Tears, we're doing it on social media now, and we're doing it with press conferences, and we're doing it with media. So that's the kind of big significant thing with this case. And if you're an indigenous citizen, the reason this case is so significant is because the first time in about 100 or more years, you have the right to be tried by your own government and in the proper fashion. Because what we have here, and I've been relating this whole case to an exposure of a really bad accounting system, right? Like for a really long time, we were shoving people into a system that had no authority over them whatsoever. And you're going to see issues and problems and corrections, but maybe it's time, and it's been way past time that we see those corrections happen. And I've often been asked, well, why did the tribes ever allow this to happen? But when you look at the composition of these tribes resettled in Oklahoma, and they could have probably fought these cases long before, and this retroactive status on it being decided by the courts right now could have probably happened 50, 70, 100 years ago, except that the people who were needing to stand up and claim their rights were people who lost millions of their, families. They were reorganized and left their homelands. They had basically they were worried about their hierarchy of needs, how to eat, how to feed their kids, how to survive. They weren't really worried about the state of Oklahoma being the court system at that time.
Yeah, I'd even add to that is that the system that was put in place that would go ahead and create these parameters of jurisdiction was always stacked against the tribes. I mean, let's just be honest. This is, if we want to take the classical systemic racism, right, that kind of institutional kind of racism, it's our legal system against tribes. It's the most convoluted system on the planet, right, in terms of law and understanding, because it's always favored and geared towards the dispossessing of people of their lands and their resources and the granting of those resources to another people. I mean, if you take a look, that's the Marshall Court from the very beginning when he crafts Johnson versus McIntosh. He gives the edict on that, and he describes all Native peoples as not owners of the land, but mere occupants of the land. Meaning you're kind of like leasing it and hanging out, but we own it, the United States does, and that's based upon the doctrine of discovery.
And when they got tired of not
Right.
owning it outright, they forced allotment onto
Yeah.
Native people so
Right.
that they could
The Dawes Act, yeah.
get that land from them.
So again, it's one edict, it's one executive order, it's one legislative maneuver, it's after another that was geared towards the dispossession, right? And so how can you, as a small minority, fight against that? The question is how you can fight against that when it's every time you wake up, you've lost. That's the beauty of this decision. I mean, talk about a role reversal. All non-Indigenous people waking up in the Creek country just got a little taste of what Creeks and all Native Americans have been dealing with when they wake up every day for the past 200 some odd years. What will the federal government do to me today? What will they take from me today? What will that decision be? Will there be termination, which is something that they practiced against tribes? Again and again and again. And all of a sudden, this one time, right here in Oklahoma, that the roles got reversed, and all of a sudden, the sky is falling, right? For those that are grappling with this, welcome to Native America, right? And with that, if you think about it in the long term, all those prior decisions to this, and others I'm sure that will come, is that we create things like ethnostress. I mean, I know I'm probably getting a little off here, but the idea that you create a world where you are constantly under a stressful situation. Will you lose your child? Will you lose your land? Will you, in what way will your world be taken from you? And if you wake up because the cards are stacked against you through the legal systems and whatever, that's ethno-stress. That's pressure that you put on you and your people. And again, we just for a moment have just reversed that role here with the McGirt decision, which is kind of, I love it, right? It's kind of like poking the bear, awakening things, and getting us to have a discussion, right? So
that leads me to my second question then, and you all kind of touched.
No.
I just want to,
Yeah, please.
30 seconds,
Yes,
promise.
absolutely.
The question included what did McGirt do?
Yeah.
What Which wasn't, what was the question again? They read the very end of it.
Yeah, absolutely. How has the July 2020 Supreme Court decision changed the composition of the state of Oklahoma and its land resources?
Quick answer, and this is as objective as it can be. Before McGirt, what had happened is the department, and more particularly the Secretary of the Interior in DC, would cherry pick tribes they would recognize officially based upon how willing those tribes were to play ball and let people come in and exploit their resources. What McGirt does is it says it's not optional anymore. You can't cherry pick, recognize this tribe, not recognize that tribe on some I like you today, I don't like you tomorrow basis. It's all officially recognized. So that's what it did.
Fabulous. No, that's perfect setup. So the current gubernatorial administration has filed a lawsuit against the U.S. Department of Interior that we were just discussing and its first native secretary for, and I quote, unlawfully attempting to strip Oklahoma of its jurisdiction to regulate surface coal mining and reclamation operations. So within the Cherokee Nation, Choctaw Nation, Chickasaw Nation, and Seminole Nation, what is the purpose of the lawsuit on behalf of the state? Is Kevin Stitt conveying something by his decision to file suit? And you can. I
have a really good opinion. I mean, I say it's good. I think that, like, I've heard a lot of my peers, my neighbors, my friends, my family, they feel like by Kevin Stitt filing this lawsuit, he's basically saying, yeah, the highest authority has spoken, but I don't like the answer. And I don't really care about you if you're a minority indigenous person, is kind of the overall feel that these communities are expressing when they see the governor of the state of Oklahoma, file to other, authorities asking to just completely wipe this out. That he wants it completely dismantled. What he's asking for is the disestablishment of our reservation. He's asking for the further disestablishment and eradication of our communities and everything that hinges on it. Because if you're an indigenous person, the land and your tribe and its relationship with the resources there are almost everything with your identity. That's what it all hinges upon. And to that extent, when we don't have this land, when we don't have this jurisdiction, what kind of existence do we have? Do we have anything at all that ties us together? Culturally, yes, but with that culture is also a really, knitted relationship with the land. So he's asking for almost in a very polite legal manner to further eradicate the tribes, is my opinion on it. But a lot of us agree.
And I would agree with that. I mean, but I'll be a little bit more harsh. I mean, if you want to boil it down to what it is, it's another theater or another episode of ethnocide. I mean, this whole effort that the United States is being geared towards to erasing identity. And whether and that comes back to, really, if you think about it, it's such a racist ideology. When you can't accept others and protect those others, but you want to go ahead and homogenize them or erase them, you're engaging in ethnocide. Removal was a process of segregation and ethnocide, boarding schools. And I lump this counter maneuver by the governor into that vein because he wants to abolish that sovereignty. He wants to erase that that tribal identity, and by so doing, make that land fair pickings for another round of colonization, right? But that's how I view it. Again, in a long stream of different episodes or institutions that the overculture has attempted to employ for those ends.
You're right, and I think that he's marketed himself as a tribal citizen. Honestly, I don't know what his cultural ties are or anything, and I'm kind of interpreting everything he does is it's in the legal realm, so it's on the legal battlefield, right. And that's where the tribal wars are being fought for their sovereignty. But he's doing it from a motivation and perspective. If you look into what the governor's platform runs on, if you look at who supports this governor, there is an obvious and very richly funded interest in his being able to push these through the courts and make sure that the state always retains rights to land and their easements and their oil and all those big interests, and that all hinges upon resources. And that's what really kind of funds, I guess. Like, I mean, he has spent more time in office waging lawsuits against tribes than I feel like he's done public health concerns. And so you really have to sit back and ask yourself, as a member of that democratic process, if the answer to a problem is your eradication, how strong is this democracy really? Because that's the overall arc of it, is that if it can happen to indigenous people, who's next on the list? What if it's poverty? What if it's other ethnic cultures? What if it's people who don't believe in this religion? When do you become the minority is the question. And that's why, in the overall sense of what is good for the Native people is also good for everyone else, is like, these are imaginary lines. Most of the people every day will cross nations' boundaries several times, never know it, probably never even realize it unless you commit a crime against a Native person. And then you're going to understand that federal charges are a little bit different than Oklahoma State's charges.
Right.
And that, in terms for our community, one that's attacked every day, and we lose women and children and men go missing, that means a lot to us, because it means that some higher authority than just the local police, who may or may not look into these things, have some kind of ability to elevate these cases to get justice for Indian people. And it means that maybe our women and children don't go missing, or maybe our families can remain intact, or maybe domestic violence doesn't happen as much to us. That's the kind of thing that's at stake when the governor's issuing his, or filing his lawsuits and stuff. It's almost like he's running from dad to mom and saying, make them stop, because that's the scope of the authority these people have, really.
Y'all good?
I'd add a little bit to that, and I try to be succinct because these are two such smart powerhouse people on either side of me. They really are. I'm impressed with them. What I would add is there's an old Japanese parable that says most of the ills, most of the murders and crimes and horrible things that happen in life come from, and I'm paraphrasing, man's inability to sit still and just have a peaceful mind for 2 minutes. And I think that applies to this. We live in a very cause and effect world. When something happens, somebody has the need or feels like they should respond or react or file something or make a counterpoint. And speaking of the governor, you have to be careful about what you start, because sometimes other people will finish it for you. Filing lawsuits about stripping coals and minerals, and the answer to that ultimately could be another McGirt type of win. And somebody as a lawyer, I would have brought that up to him and saying, don't ask questions that you may not want the answer to, that might hurt you more. But what could have been taken as a win with McGirt by the current administration, the governor, there was just a whirl of a response. And what we could really do with this is, Oklahoma is the Native American state. It's on our license plates. Everybody knows that. And so for McGirt to have been decided, that was a big opportunity for us to come together as a state and have something unique, have something special that no other state has. We don't have a professional football team, but we could have had, the biggest landmass that had a tribe in it. And there's a lot of great things that can come from that. Now, I try to stay objective with this, but what the current Attorney General, Governor Stitt are doing, and I'm as Republican as they come. Forgive me, I'll crawl underneath the table. I'm a business attorney. I represent rich people. What do you want me to do? I was Aubrey McClendon's personal attorney and helped him through a lot of stuff when he was still alive. God bless him. But what you're talking about is, or what the current administration has done, Governor Stitt and the Attorney General, they have turned this into something that is rationally believable and kind of spin propelled, if you will, on social media and what you read in the newspapers to say this is their argument. You want to hear it, I'll tell you what it is. McGirt detours investment from out-of-state people. We're going to take a decision that we don't like. We're going to say, hey, if we allow this to stand, it's going to scare everybody away and nobody's going to come to Oklahoma anymore. That's what it is. That's the argument. And so while that makes sense rationally, it goes around what the law is and what constitutionally we have agreed to do over the course of 200 years. To say that we need to overturn McGirt or look at it or poke holes in it or, make it conform or pertain just to criminal things and federal major crimes and not civil stuff, which is what they're trying to do with these lawsuits. I lost my point.
But it's about big business. It
Right.
really is.
Instead of doing that, we could use it to bring people together. Basically, is what I'm trying to say. We don't want to take a decision that could have been a good thing and use it for bad.
I'll build on that, right? Because in what you talked earlier about his assaults on the casinos and things of this nature, there just tends to be a trend here, an anti-Indigenous trend, right?
And he remarketed right before the McGirt decision too. Remember when they pulled down, Oklahoma's logo and they changed it to something not identifiable as Native. And there's been this leading up to it. We've analyzed the media on it, and he was setting up to really go to battle from the very beginning. And
so there's a metaphorical unzippering that's been going on here. I mean, the true individual and what he's trying to accomplish. But to me, these kind of behaviors and these kind of decisions, and it's all based upon a sense of fear. I mean, a fear that somehow, if the tribes oversee their resources, the sky is falling.
To quickly finish my point.
Oh, okay.
No. I'm going to let you finish. I had a brain fart about it. You're up here trying to think of so many things to say. Forgive me. What I basically was going to say was to say that this detours investment in Oklahoma. That be careful with that, because that can be used against you. When we came over from England, we abolished bills of attainder, which are basically laws passed against, which say, Chris Griswold can't go to Dunkin' Donuts on a Saturday, that kind of a thing. What you're talking about, if you extend this out, the rewriting of the Constitution to fit what the current administration wants it to say or not say, it could easily be said that England could come over and say, well, even though y'all had your Civil War and won, you're still an English colony. So just, that's the same thing.
You just have to realize that at some point somebody's more powerful than you and can strip your power as well. And it's kind of indicative too, if you keep making the argument that investment will become difficult, and I believe that it will actually. That's just a reality, because now the system will say, do I want to come build a plant here? Well, maybe you should talk to the tribes as your first step. It really forces investors to work within those 3 circles instead of just 2, which makes their jobs more difficult. But also what you're saying when it's inconvenient, so let's change the law, is that these people don't matter and their rights don't matter because they're inconvenient and their existence is inconvenient to us making money. So you don't want to keep carrying that message forward, or you look like Governor Stitt on Twitter. I mean, and that's not very pleasant for anyone.
Okay. All right. Good. I just wanted to make sure. So this this question is probably at the more in Angel's jurisdiction, but obviously you two have opinions as well. So there's been a marked increase, I should say, in the media presence of the tribes, right? And the benefits of tribal relationships within the state in the last decade. But I'm specifically thinking of the United Oklahoma commercials that have been very prolific in the last couple of years. So how's the Hearts and Minds campaign been successful for rallying support, or at least a better understanding of tribal issues?
I think that the United for Oklahoma did a really good job of just kind of hammering in a message that we're here and we help communities. Even the ones that are not citizens benefit from our presence. And that was one of the things that started rolling out when we were in gaming compacts, because gaming compacts really, before any tribe gets to use any of the money from gaming, they cut off a chunk of it and give it to the state. They don't get to ask the state what it's done with it. They don't get to see an accounting for it, but it's your operation cost right off the top. And a lot of people don't understand that. For the Muskogee Creek Nation alone, each year, $155 million is taken from our gaming fund and given to the state of Oklahoma, no questions asked. it's almost like a bribe to operate. I mean, like, let us do our business, and here's your cut. And the concept of this whole, permission side of it, and these campaigns were like, when the governor put his letter to the editor in, that was a call to the tribes to come to the landlord's office. We're going to renegotiate your rent, guys, is what the governor said to the tribes. And all of them went, gosh, you just put that on a Post-it note on my door and didn't even call me, which was really ludicrous of him to do. They seen that the scope of this was going to change, and they knew that McGirt was in the Supreme Court, and they knew that there was going to be a campaign to tear down, tribal nations. And so they started their own. They started talking about the millions of dollars we put into roads, into healthcare, into the millions of dollars that we put into schools. There are several schools in the Muskogee Creek Nation jurisdiction that entire 4-year-old programs are funded completely. No one asks a question about if those kids are citizens or not. They just fund it. They know that early childhood education benefits everybody in our community, and they just do it. So they really started getting hip to advocating for themselves in the presence of other people, because that's not something that's really intrinsic in Native communities. We just don't go around cheerleading ourselves a whole lot. It's not a value that we ever felt needed to be done. We just do what we do. We come to work every day. We kind of just be ourselves. And when you see these battles starting to break into media, you start to realize what's at stake is really the public opinion court. And that changes the scope of everything. And I know that people will argue with you all day long and say, oh, no, judges are very clear and objective, but public opinion does matter. And so they've put money into it. They've actually done it in a team environment where the tribes teamed up, because they've realized that the Muskogee Nation could contribute this much, or the Seminole Nation could contribute this much, but there's 39 of them here. And if they all get together and start marketing this, then it's going to change, and they have a bigger budget, they have a bigger reach. And another thing that's happening right now because of McGirt is mainstream media has gone bonkers trying to cover it. Like, they just don't understand what treaties are. And I'm not trying to be insulted to any, professional journalist. I've spent 13 years doing this, and on a daily basis, I'm like, what does this mean? Because Indian law, treaties, none of it's simple, none of it's easy to understand. And when you unpack it all with the history and context, I feel really bad for the journalists who never have any exposure to Indigenous communities. They're not the simplest things to report on.
Right.
So they do have a hard time. And working with like Oklahoma Media Center, we've started tracking how many stories have come out. And in the last 6 months, there's been 290 different McGirt stories. So it's blowing up basically in the media.
But it's a great turning point here in terms of trying to understand. I mean, it's bringing a public awareness to something that's been so pushed to the peripheries. We can think of that even in a historical context and long-term of the American narrative, but in a more contemporary mode, it's a great awakening. There's a swell tide, as I would say.
Even Hollywood's getting in on this, Reservation Dogs is the big hit show right now, and we all love to watch it. And so the media is the platform now. It's goes from courtroom to media. That's where these things are taking place, and that's where history is being written.
Hi, Mr. Gorham. How are you?
Good. How are you?
We are very glad to have you. We've got a new panelist. Mr. Herschel Gorham is the general counsel for the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes. We are very lucky to have him here. Sorry about the rain. So we were just discussing, I'll pose this question to you, that there's been a marked increase in the media presence of the tribes and the benefits of tribal relationships within the state. And I was talking specifically about the United Oklahoma commercials. So what do you think about the Hearts and Minds campaign? Is that helping, or has it been successful in rallying support for tribal issues, or at least a better understanding of?
I think it has. I know that our governor participated in those commercials as well. We were heavily involved with the United for Oklahoma campaign, particularly whenever we were going through the gaming compact issue. So I believe that was how that was actually born primarily, was as a result of the gaming compact. I think that anytime you try to win the hearts and minds of people, that it's always going to be better than attacking people, right? Mm-hmm. So just like in the military, anybody who served in the military, especially during the Iraq or Afghanistan conflicts, if you were under General Petraeus at that time, his whole deal was, let's win the hearts and minds of the people. because that's the best way you're going to be effective. So absolutely, I mean, the United for Oklahoma campaign is good.
Any other thoughts about the media? Any of you? No, you all good? Okay. All right. So how does the state of Oklahoma move forward then? So we've heard a lot of, very almost dystopian commentary. I feel like we're very almost divided. And as you guys can see, the state map is up, and that's post McGirt. So it does feel very, bifurcated, if you will. So how does the state of Oklahoma move forward, united, in order to resolve the shared problems of governance while seemingly so divided politically and, again, kind of geographically at this point? Is there validity to what Governor Stitt has said about the McGirt decision, quote, creating a public safety nightmare for victims and law enforcement? Anybody?
Okay, I'll start there. That's kind of really loaded with a lot of components to it. Thanks so much. I think that, what needs to happen, there's just me, right, in my little world, but moving towards what we'd call a concept of reconciliation, just a recognition. I mean, I think for most part, on this grander scale, that's what tribes are looking for, just a recognition and a reconciliation, right? We're not trying to put up walls and kick people out and rechange things, but just rebalance, whether that's the narrative, whether that's the legal landscape, whether it's the cultural landscape, but just bringing that greater, let's say that's kind of inclusiveness that Oklahoma truly is, right? Here, as I would say, in the hub of Indian country. Now, that's just my little take on it, that can happen, that if things would change and different perspectives would be employed. But that will not happen, in my opinion, would be with the current rhetoric that is being spewed from our governor. His initial knee-jerk reaction to the McGirt case was one of, as I've said, the sky is falling, that there's going to be chaos, that there will be cats and dogs living together, mayhem, whatever it is, right? That it's going to be the end of the world. And I cannot think of a more racist concept, because what that basically says is, me, the current great white father here in Oklahoma, knows how to go ahead and run the ship, and these tribes don't. That their systems are primitive or savage. It harkens back to the foundations of racist ideologies and all of these things. He may not realize that's what he's saying, but that is what he's saying. And he's saying that these tribes are incapable, right? And we have the more civilized, white, Western, however you want to describe it, but we can handle this, they can't. And I just found that does nothing but really alienate those that could be your advocates, your adversaries, your partners in creating a greater Oklahoma. He instead creates a cultural and legal divide. I mean, and that's just my take on it. So that's the problem with that terminology coming right out, right after the decision. Now you got to deal with that. Now you got to try cleanup. You got to repair fences. You got to repair relationships. I don't know if he's the one with hammer and saw in hand to do that, but that's my take on it.
I guess I would chime in and add to that. My 2 cents. As a lawyer, and I'd like to think, again, as I've said before, I'm the neutral business attorney who's just trying to simply advise people on both sides of the aisle on how to invest and how to make business decisions about their commercial properties or their net wealth, whatever that is, whatever that is comprised of. But on its face, there's nobody that can agree. I mean, there's nobody that can disagree that to say something like that, the quote, isn't anything short of saying, hey, this is a threat to public safety. In parentheses, the tribes are idiots. They can't do it themselves. We have to do it for them. Yes, that smacks of that. But I'd like to back up and just, what I would add to that point is this. Like I said a while ago, that Japanese parable, all the ills of mankind are centered around somebody's inability to sit down and just be at rest in their mind for 2 minutes and think clearly before they act. What I would have told Governor Stitt if I'd been on his legal team is, in the world of tightened budgetary constraints, this pandemic is pushed everybody. Let's be honest. There's opportunity that's come out of it, but it's stressed out a lot of people. There are a lot of businesses. 66% of all small businesses failed during the pandemic. And all you hear about is Governor Stitt trying to clean house and try to make things cheaper, better, faster, quicker, swifter, better, that kind of thing. This could have easily been seen as an opportunity to say, hey, let's phase the tribes in to manage to manage this land more than we are, and there's a tax savings that we could reap from it. If that's what we're so interested in doing, which it obviously is. That it's an easy low hanging piece of fruit. But you have to stop and you got to slow down and you got to quit talking and run your mouth all the time to see that opportunity.
I think his approach to this has been wrong. I think it was wrong in his approach that he used on the gaming compact. When he came out with that op-ed, was it 2.5 years ago? It caught everybody off guard when he said, we're going to raise the gaming compact sharing revenue to 25%. And he didn't ask any of the tribes their input on what they thought about it. His Secretary of Indian Affairs at the time, Lisa Billy, didn't even know about it. She was caught off guard as well. So he has all these key people around him that he could include to make everybody feel like they're a part of the team. But instead of doing that, he's gone this awkward other approach. And I think that what he's doing right now is nothing more than a scare tactic, if you want to call it that. We've got to do this, otherwise there's going to be pandemonium. But he's not looking at the fact that the five tribes generally, including like Osage Nation as well, have all been gearing up and are ready for this. Cherokee Nation just recently approved a $30.1 million increase to their Attorney General's budget and their court budget to prepare for this. And that's just within Cherokee Nation territory. Creek Nation has done similar funding to prepare for it. Choctaw Nation has as well. I'm not sure about Chickasaw Nation, but I believe they've upped the ante on their Light Horse Police Department there. The only one I'm not really sure about is Seminole Nation, but I believe even they have added additional money to their budget to prepare for it. So the tribes are wholly invested. And part of the United for Oklahoma campaign is that tribes were here before Oklahoma was a state. They're still here, and they're going to be here long after. If anybody is invested in the welfare and security of the state, it's the 39 Indian tribes that are here. So if you look at some of the other states that have reservations around there, like say Minnesota or South Dakota or Wyoming or North Dakota, where a good proportion of the state is made up of reservation, they're not having those issues that Governor Stitt's bringing up as there's going to be widespread criminal activity going on. And again, the activity is limited, right? I mean, that the tribes are going to be over because the Indian Major Crimes Act is still in place. And that's going to be the federal government that will have jurisdiction in those cases.
Thank you.
I think if I had to make some predictions, I would predict that something that Chris just said earlier was absolutely true. Those questions that you keep asking for answers for are going to get answered. I think they're going to get answered in the courts. And I think that it's going to be to the, sad face to the governor, if he keeps doing that. We seen early on, right after the decision, there was talk of the 280 state. There was talk about that they were going to ask for disestablishment, and we seen the tribes rally. And what the tribes started doing in the very few days after McGirt is the tribes started reallocating their budgets into hiring Light Horse. They were hiring judges. We, as a tribe of the Muskogee Nation, pay our judges the same as federal judges make. That was a different piece of legislation that they wanted to prepare for, because if we're going to have an increased caseload, we want to have qualified judicial people, and we want to keep them, and we don't want them to run off and just, I can make more money somewhere else. So they've invested, and they actually even got contacted by the larger cities, jails, and they said, we have citizens that are coming into your jails, and now that this case has come out, it's a strain on our budgets. The Muskogee Creek Nation contributes over money to every single jail that in its jurisdiction that holds a Native American citizen in there. So there's a lot of money being invested from the tribal nations' perspectives. Another thing that's going to happen, I think, is that a citizen of one of these tribes is going to file a civil suit, because when I call 911 right now, they ask me this question first: are you a citizen of a native tribe? And they have no business asking me that. I made a medical call to 911, and before they would send an ambulance to my house, they wanted to know my tribal affiliation. And it's absolutely atrocious, because early on in the research of how this was going to play out, the Attorney General of Oklahoma sent advisement to all local law enforcement saying, carry on as normal, answer the calls, forward to tribal nation, law enforcement where you need to, but keep people safe. Public safety matters. They said that, but there's this weird practice going on where they're just not doing what they're saying they're doing on paper. So I think we're going to see civil rights violation lawsuits. I think that this stuff is going to get cleared up, but it's going to be in the legal landscape, and it's going to be one of those things that the state of Oklahoma will be sorry it kept asking those questions and forcing us to defend our rights, is what's probably going to be the case. And I think that the best solution that's going to ever come from this is going to be one that sits down with every single sovereign nation and is done the way that sovereign nation needs it to look, because some of these sovereign nations are not as big as the others. They don't have the resources that the others do. Some of them are ready to compact with law enforcement and make sure that city and state police can come and help them. However, others are saying, no, hard line, sovereignty, we're taking care of this ourselves, because every time we compact with the state, we lose something, and they don't want to do it anymore. So those will look different, and it'll look different in different areas, and it'll make the business investor end of this very complicated, because there will be people who will be like, well, I'm wanting to do this, and where's the best place in Oklahoma? And you might not know at first. You'll have to do the research.
I want to ask, we've mentioned or brought up the gaming compact a couple of different times. Mr. Gorham, can you give us just a brief synopsis for anybody in the audience who is not aware of that situation or that occurrence?
The gaming compact?
Yes, yeah, the fight, the argument or lawsuit.
Okay. Yeah, so the original compact that was signed or that was passed by state question, I forgot what it is, was that 2004, 2005 timeframe. But it said that it would be up for renewal if certain things were triggered in 15 years, basically. When Governor Stitt came out with his op-ed in July, I want to say 2018, he basically said that the compact does not automatically renew, whereas the tribes were arguing that the compact did automatically renew because there were certain things that had already been triggered that said that it was going to automatically renew. Of course, that went to litigation, of course, and I believe the Judge DeGiusse from the Western District ultimately ruled in favor of the tribes that the compact did automatically renew. That was just another loss that Governor Stitt incurred, but a lot of us think that it could have been different had he approached things differently. Yeah. Had he met with the tribes together, not through counsel, not through former Attorney General Mike Hunter arguing on his behalf, but himself meeting with tribal leader to tribal leader, consultation between state and tribes. It could have been a lot different outcome, because there could have been some situations where some of the tribes maybe would have said, yes, we can do this if we get this, right? But that led to the Oklahoma Supreme Court also ruling that those compacts that were signed by Comanche Nation and Oto were invalid compacts. So it's, when you go at things incorrectly, you're going to get wrong results. And I think that's what happened in those two instances. And I think the issue with McGirt is basically the same thing that's happening.
I don't think he was really paying attention to the landscape when those compacts first were wrought out and agreed upon, because that was no easy easy task to get everybody in agreement. And he kind of neglected to take the advice of the people who came before him. And they said, look, this was a very challenging thing to get done. And the state of Oklahoma was very glad to have the additional resources and contributions from the tribe. And so they protected the fact that that was a difficult thing to get done. They actually put that renewal clause in there, knowing that unless some miracle happens and we all suddenly agree on the same thing very easily, you don't want these compacts to have to go into renegotiations. They didn't want the next governors to have to ever, try as hard as they did to get that done. And so they put that language in there knowing that it would be very difficult to ever get everyone on the same page again. And now we're seeing that, because they asked that question, now they got an answer. So now the tribes know we don't have to come to the table and agree with you on anything. See what the loss is for the state of Oklahoma? I mean, that's a bummer.
All right, so I have one more question before we open it up to the audience. So this is kind of the conclusive, wrapping it up in a little bow. So how overall will the McGirt decision impact our children's futures in the state of Oklahoma? What does the big picture look like 10, 15 years from now?
God, I need my magic 8-ball, right?
Did I befuddle you?
I think that's one of the things that I'm kind of counting on and hoping for is that the future in Oklahoma for Indigenous communities means a more empowered generation. Mm-hmm. I think that we've needed this for a very long time, especially for our community to feel like we are practicing sovereignty, we're taking care of ourselves. And I think that we might see, especially in the next few years, if this trend of anti-nativeness continues, I think that we'll have a very woke generation of natives who will have experienced some of the things. I didn't necessarily experience anti-native things. I don't look native, and so my parents maybe kind of did. They told me a few times about instances, but that was my parents. So we might see a generation of kids coming up real salty and getting into tribal law and doing some things for their tribes. You know what I mean? I'm looking forward to that generation who's coming out swinging on a solid sovereign nation's, backbone.
I mean, I agree. I think that it's going to make a lot more people be aware of the native issues that are here in Oklahoma. We were having a conversation with some of my coworkers about a week ago, and I was talking about whenever I was growing up that in the 9th grade that you had to take Oklahoma history. Mm-hmm. And I said, interestingly enough, I said I was in El Reno at the time, and my tribe, Cheyenne Arapaho tribes, are right outside of El Reno. Our headquarters are. I said, but the only tribes they mentioned in the Oklahoma history books were the 5 tribes that they called the 5 civilized tribes at that time. I said, there was not one word or mention about the Cheyenne and Arapaho tribes or the Kiowa tribe or the Wichita tribe or Apache or Comanche or any of the other 30 plus tribes that were in existence at the time. I said, so anybody who's not aware, I said, you always have to wonder if they're totally reliant upon our school system or people that are around them to educate them about knowledge in Indian affairs, that it's going to be lacking. But maybe this McGirt decision is going to change that, because it's going to make a lot more people be aware that, okay, this is actually the reservation. These are the boundary lines. Everything within these boundary lines encompasses the reservation and therefore falls in the definition of an Indian country per USC 181151, right? So I think that my hope is along the same here, is that it's going to make a lot more of our children be involved. Maybe some of those that are identifiably Native and those that are not, but they're enrolled as Native, or they're considered Native American by definition of their tribe. One last bit on that. When I was in law school, a lot of my classmates that were not Native, they chose to not take any Indian law classes. But those are the same ones that will call me now or email me when they have a question or an issue, and they'll say, hey, what about this? I'm like, and so I'll answer their question, but I think it just made the scope a lot more important that half of Indian Oklahoma is still considered a reservation or Indian country, and there's a lot of issues in Indian country, and those issues need to be acknowledged. And if that gets more people involved and aware, then to me, that's a good thing.
What about the two of you with actual children?
I would add this. What's going to happen in the next 10 or 15 years, I don't know. It's hard to look in your crystal ball and know that, but it will be a product of what we know and what our attitude is. And so that is something that we have control of. There's things you have control of and then things you don't. What I'd like to see is both sides become aware, both sides of the aisle, if that's, the right or wrong way to phrase it, Governor Stitt and his supporters and people that are, behind Native American lands and tribal sovereignty, which is constitutionally based. That's what we've been saying all day. And it's the right thing to do. But each side needs to know what the other side bears, their weaknesses. It's like a SWOT analysis in the business world, and I've been given that perspective all day long. What are my strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats? Each side needs to know what the other side is burdened by. For example, people don't realize that there's something called dual sovereignty that Indians have. They're citizens of both their tribe and the United States, which is right. That's how it should be. However, the drawback to that, the weakness of that, is that they're subject to double jeopardy. As a non-Indian, if I get hailed into either state or federal court and I'm found not guilty, I can't be retried for that. An Indian can. That's something that it's not all gravy. And so for Governor Stitt to approach all this is something that's been hugely lost, and they're getting all the goody and I'm not getting anything. That's a fallacy. That's a product of something that we can educate ourselves about, our kids, and from that form proper attitudes.
Just, I think, to build upon all that's been said, the future, I think that we are in a good movement, right? Even though we have been talking about hiccups and speed bumps and ignorance and things of that nature, I think overall we're in a right direction. I've been contemplating this idea that it just seems like we're in this moment of this tide swell of indigeneity. Sterling's got his reservation dogs that's coming out, and it's waking up the nation who are tapping into this program about, hey, here's what kind of it is down in Anadarko and places like this. I know it's got its own twists and foibles, but it's an awakening. The FAM just opened up, a week or two ago. I mean, right here at the crossroads, like I said, like this hub of Indian country. The growth of Native American Studies programs. So I'm putting my little plug in there, right? But throughout academia. Right, this is a trend that's been going on, let's say, since 1900, since maybe the emergence of the Society of American Indians, right? And it's just going to continue to build and build. And in that, of course, a far more educated, astute, savvy Native population that can exist here and not have to worry so much about what's coming at them. And at the same time, one of the things that I hope that in programs like I've got, and what I want, right, I think we do want this in Oklahoma, is the shrinking of the cultural divides of misunderstanding, of ignorance, racism at times. And if we can shrink those cultural divides, my gosh, what you've been saying, this could be an incredible place to be. But we've got to all be participants in that. But I think we're moving in that direction. Talk about a woke generation, right? My kids this past year, both of them, without talking to each other, my daughter switched from being she wanted to save sharks, right? So she went to the UH Manoa to do a marine biology, and then she goes, oh, that sucks. And so she quickly slipped into political science because she loved Native Hawaiian issues. And the next thing I know, she's going, I'm going to go for Indigenous law. And we were talking about this. So she wants to go and do Indigenous law on a global pattern at UH Manoa. And my son, a week later, goes, yeah, I think I'm going to come back to OU and try to do Native law. They're both Eastern Band Cherokee. And so they want to. They're part, I think, of this generation that's just going to keep going. Maybe hearkening back to good old W.E.B. Du Bois, a talented 10th, right? That's going to just keep the momentum going. And all this, I would say, though, the McGirt case and other things, and I had read this and I wanted to put it in my notes, I got to put it in here, but I love what Justice Hugo Black said long ago, and we can apply it here. And I think Gorsuch held to this as well. Gorsuch said, hold the government to its word. And that's what we're doing with this case. And reflecting what Hugo Black had said, great nations, like great men, should keep their word. So the question is, who will be these great men that will keep their word what does this mean about our nation and our state? And I hope that we can just continue the path that way. It's my view.
That was a lovely way to wrap up. Can we give our panel a round of applause? Thank you guys so much. All right, are there any questions from the audience? Yes, ma'am. I'll try to repeat it if I can hear you.
What do you think this effect will be for other tribes across the U.S.?
Oh, it's a big, big thing. It really is. One of the things that we kind of like recognized right away was like, I had letters and like emails coming from First Nations people, like saying, this is incredible. We've never seen it like this before. One of the podcasts that we had done about McGirt was, I was hearing people in Japan talking about it. And this is the thing that people aren't understanding, I think, too, in outside of Indigenous societies. I think in Indigenous societies, we understand it. There's a lot of Indigenous people all over the place. And so anytime, and this is such a Native kind of characteristic, anytime one of us shines, we all shine. And this thing is really kind of throwing out into the universe some really great ripples. I think it's empowering a lot of people. I think it's unfortunate that it had to be this case with such horrible content and over such horrible subject matter. But I think that the tribes are taking this and they're running with it. And I think that it will mean that more tribes across the United States get to, kind of push their sovereignty just a little bit forward too.
You asked that question, and almost the moment this case came out and I'm reading it, I'm just like salivating. I'm going, this is awesome, right? But I'm reflecting on what's going to happen with the Black Hills. What does that mean for Lakota nations, right? Who never took the paycheck, right? Who never took the money, and now all that it could pay incredible dividends. I'm just a thought, right? Boy, you talk about, CNAs are in the process also buying part of the Bear Butte area and reclaiming that. So what does that mean in terms of reclaiming? And I don't know, I'm all curious of that, but boy, that whole Lakota reservation, I think that could be something very interesting down the road. So I don't know if it will be, but I'm kind of waiting for it. So.
The interesting thing about that question is that before McGirt, of course, there was Murphy v. Sharp, right? But even before that, you go back to 2016 and the Supreme Court ruled in Nebraska v. Parker that the Omaha Reservation had never been disestablished by Congress. So the Omaha tribe before McGirt fought that same battle to say that, hey, our reservation was never disestablished by Congress. And the Supreme Court agreed with them. And in that ruling, just like in McGirt, only Congress can disestablish a reservation. So while a lot of people think that the McGirt case was only geared towards the Creek Nation or the 5 tribes, it actually applies to every single tribe across the country, because any tribe who has ever wondered whether their reservation was properly disestablished, they are now looking into it, because the Supreme Court has made it clear we are not going to do Congress's job for them. If they want to disestablish that reservation, they must say so. And they must do so with clear and convincing language, as they have done in some other instances where they've disestablished reservations. So I think it woke up a lot of tribes across the country that are now looking into whether or not their reservations were disestablished. I think there's probably little unknown cases where some people are challenging the jurisdiction of the state whenever they get into criminal trouble, citing that, hey, via McGirt, this reservation was never disestablished, and asking their attorneys to fight that battle for them. In some cases, it's a long, hard-fought battle, and they may actually lose, but there's going to be some cases that are going to come along, like Nebraska v. Parker, where they're going to win, and the Omaha tribe, they won that case.
I think to quote the language out of the McGirt decision, the leading justice said basically, Congress may wish sometimes that an inconvenient reservation would disappear, but wishes don't make for laws. It has to be expressly done.
Yes, sir.
Well, I can't pretend to know the answers because I really don't. And you guys are like history scholars. Stay on the long one. I do. But I've been hearing y'all talk. There's a question I had that came to mind. So I was thinking, do you guys think it would help if we humble ourselves, compare ourselves to what and those tribes choose what they most feel and just like persons there and express what they're feeling so that we can give them an answer?
I think that anytime we get to like set aside our own feelings and try to understand where other people are coming from, you're going to get to a better place and you're going to find better solutions for all of your problems. Anytime that you can take the moment, take as much time as you can to understand, what another person, another side of the aisle is talking about, I think you're going to come out to be, in a much better shape at the end of that conversation for sure.
Yeah, I would build on that. I think one of the things I start my classes with is what I'm hoping to establish is a sense of understanding that then helps create empathy. Right? And I'm just building upon what you're saying, using just a different word. But the idea of if we can understand what Native peoples have gone through, right, as non-natives, and then maybe we can understand why they're making decisions and why they're saying and doing things. Same thing with Black Lives Matter or Chicano movements, whatever it is, right? If we can step away from those cultural, racial divides and just grasp some empathy and say, oh, okay, maybe I can understand why that. Like I said, I'm hoping to bring those worlds together. Anyway.
We have a question from the side of the room, or from the internet, I guess. Sweet, live stream questions. We are being watched, people.
All right, so it says, with the McGirt 2020 and early 2021 defining national boundaries, how are non-tribal citizens who live in tribal nations boundaries represented in the border? And how will this see the borders of Oklahoma redefined, recognizing the 38 sovereignty?
I'm envisioning like borders, like border patrol and things like that, and I just hope that like that's never a part of our future.
Are we talking not new walls, right?
Yeah, no more walls.
Like the checkerboard pattern of what the allotment created under the Dawes Act? Is that what?
I think that people think of it like a big group of land and they want to see like a fence put around it. But honestly, within the Muskogee Creek Nation, it's 11 counties. And there's a lot of non-native citizens and there's a lot of native citizens who own land side by side. And I don't think that will ever change. If you look at the city of Los Angeles, it's the same way. And I don't think that we'll see like, you see it on the highway when you're leaving Oklahoma City, you'll see like, I'm now entering the Muskogee Nation. But I think that's just more for your like awareness, kind of like we're here, kind of a feeling. And I don't think that it'll ever be, and like even right now, you can go onto reservations. It's not like you have to like get clearance to get in there. It's kind of been a problem during the pandemic, that you can just go on reservations and you can be a tourist. So it's not like we shouldn't have border patrol, but if we're bringing back the Red Stick Warriors, maybe okay.
I'm not sure what the intent of the question is, but I kind of took it a little bit as if someone might be concerned that they might fall under the jurisdiction of the tribe if they're non-native. But I think there's been plenty of case law out there that has already addressed that issue. One case law that comes to mind is the Montana rule, where the Supreme Court basically ruled that unless an individual enters a consensual relationship with the tribe that's non-native, that they can't be held liable to the jurisdiction of the tribe. And even then, that would be for like a civil case, right? But even a non-native crime against a non-native, even if that falls within Indian country, that still falls in the jurisdiction of the state. And that's been ruled on several times as well. So I don't think there's any worry or concern that a non-native should have about being within the boundary of a reservation, because tribes and individuals all across the country where there's lots of reservations, large reservations, like Navajo tribe in Arizona, Colorado, New Mexico, they're on 4 different states, right? So they've been in that relationship for a long time. And there's never really been any issues that have arisen out of that. So.
Yeah, the person themselves determines the sovereignty to be applied.
Right. And I know when you're talking about those, I was thinking like the Oliphant case, which basically defines that, the non-natives can't be held within jurisdiction. So that's, again, I don't think there's any fear whatsoever. The only thing, and you mentioned that like the Montana exceptions or exclusions, right? And boy, you've got to be doing something nefarious. I mean, you got to be living in Indian country and dumping all sorts of toxic waste, right? That may have an impact downriver, literally, and impact the tribe in a negative way for the tribe to even step in. But other than that, and of course, when you have contractual arrangements that you're held accountable to that. But I mean, life's good, right? It's really no worries that I see whatsoever.
I think that there's been a case where a tribal light horse with probable cause can hold like a non-native citizen for a short time. But also, I mean, if you're visiting France, the French police will hold you, you know what I mean? Like, you see the lights, you kind of obey the law, and you cooperate. If you're in Washington, D.C., there's about 5 or 6 different legal entities with various levels of authority over your whereabouts and where you might and might not go. So this isn't a new concept in the world. This isn't a new concept at all. And the only thing like really that a person would have to worry about is those basic things that you learned in kindergarten and keeping your hands to yourself for the most part. I mean,
Yeah, any law enforcement agency of whatever sovereignty it is has a reasonable opportunity to briefly detain you to make a determination to see if a crime has been committed. It's not sending you to jail for the rest of your life.
No, and the only thing Oliphant did, I believe, in my opinion, is that it prevents an Indian tribe from prosecuting a non-Indian Indian individual for a criminal offense. But it does not mean that they cannot hold them until the proper authorities arrive, like county police or local police or anything like that. But I think that as long as the Indian tribes and the state and the different counties strive to get along with one another and not be afraid to enter into cross-deputization agreements, that more of those issues can be relieved. I know that on the western side of the state, or northwestern, where Cheyenne Rapids are at, we've only got 1 or 2 counties that are openly agreeable to entering into like a cross-deputization type agreement, where some of the other counties just simply don't even want to bother doing it. And I think you're going to see that all across the state. You're going to see some counties that are in favor of it, and you're going to see some counties that they don't want to do it. And whatever that reason, but we're all here. Tribes are, like I said, they were here before Oklahoma became a state. They're going to be here for a long time afterwards. So let's get along. Let's do what we have to do to protect everybody. So,
Other audience questions? Yes, sir.
So do you all believe, well, this is more question. So do you all believe that the McGirt decision can serve as the basis for a nationalized land dive program? And if you do you think that during that process, you will also have a re-examination of what is indigenous, just mostly in the framework of from a previous perspective? I know a lot of people, some counselors were a little bit disappointed after Secretary Holland was in office. Some of her previous statements not proven.
well, I think that like with the McGirt, I don't think that it'll necessarily like flip land ownership back to anyone, but I think the awareness that people are, getting from trying to understand the historical context of tribal land and sovereignty, I think it will in some ways kind of help that conversation move forward. And I think that we're going to be seeing some really groundbreaking kind of dealings when it comes to the freedmen right now. We're seeing people who are saying, well, if this 1866 treaty is good for your jurisdiction, it's probably good for your citizenship base too, and the fact that these citizens were included in the tribe at one point and now are not. And specifically in like 1970 something, they like readopted, I guess, the Constitution and left out freedmen. And I think that we'll see that we're already hearing that there's so I don't know what you would even call it, but like there's certain senators and congressmen out there who are, just trying to like work that angle in and say that, well, we're going to reduce federal dollars if you don't comply with your own treaty and include these freedmen in your tribes. So I think there's some traction being made, and I think that it will kind of change the scope of that. I think the fear, though, for the broad perspective, right? My concern, if my tribe lingers too long and allows the federal government to force a decision on us, then we lose some of our sovereignty, right? But if we do what we need to do and adopt our policies and adopt our, and enshrine our laws ourselves before the federal government has this daddy figure kind of telling us what to do, then we do better. If we stay out of the federal courts with it, we'll do better. I want to see my tribe kind of move in a direction of self-governance, and self-governance means you don't ask the Supreme Court to solve your problems for you. So that's kind of my feelings on it.
I don't think it's going to flip any land back either. I think that tribes are going to continue to move forward and do what they have always done, which is when the opportunity presents itself, they're going to buy land back in their original reservation in order to build their land back as it maybe was before the allotment period came along.
And trust is easier to get now, too.
Yeah, you don't have to send it all the way to DC, which took like an extra 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 months longer in some cases. But I did want to mention briefly that unfortunately, when it comes to Indian law, that there's not always that bright line rule that you may see in some other cases where it's a criminal case or a civil case. It seems like it really depends upon who's in the 10th Circuit or who's in the Western District or who's in the Supreme Court that will often determine how an Indian law case will go. And he mentioned double jeopardy earlier, right? And that case actually came about, and I don't remember the name of the case, but it was a Supreme Court case where an individual assaulted a BIA police officer, and the tribe, under their sovereign right, they prosecuted the individual because he was a Native American, and they prosecuted him for assaulting the police officer. Well, the court ultimately ruled that the defendant cannot claim double jeopardy because the tribe was a sovereign nation, and that did not prevent another sovereign nation, the United States, from prosecuting him as well. So a lot of times those Indian law cases come about as to how can they rule most favorable against the Indian tribe, right? And in that case, they didn't rule against Indian tribe, but they did make a ruling in that case that allowed the federal government to also prosecute that individual as well and not be able to claim double jeopardy. That's real interesting.
So when the governor starts saying that everything's going to go crazy, I'm almost like, well, there's kind of an extra layer of accountability for making, Native Americans act right in accordance with the law, is because like if the tribe doesn't prosecute you for a misdemeanor, for example, or the major crimes, which they can't, and the federal government has restrictions on those punishments, then you got your other level that's going to come in and smack you down too. And we've seen it happen too, that the tribes are going to stack those like extra charges on there just because that they want to show that they're addressing the problem too. So there's, I guess if like for me, for example, if I go and commit a misdemeanor, in the Muskogee Nation, on the one hand, it's kind of handy because my misdemeanor fees from the tribe are going to be lighter than they would be at the state. But if I commit a major crime, dude, it's federal pen, for me, because it's going to be bad.
All right, we have time for one last question. Yes.
So this sort of goes back to something else mentioned right at the very beginning. It has to do with sort of like kind of after other people went into retrials after the McGirt case. And that basically said that like they didn't really consider retrial under the finding of the McGirt case, the decision that was made. I guess I find it really interesting because there are plenty of instances in retrials where like allowing a person to retrial back when the evidence has arisen or possibly giving interpretations of what was meant. And I mean, in this case, they're not talking about the interpretation, we're just talking about a law, a constitutional law that has existed for a very long time. And in some cases, it's not just neglected, but possibly even deliberately ignored. Like as I believe Mr. Griswold mentioned, your opinion as to why that sort of decision was passed? Like, do you think it's perhaps more damage control? Just like because of how chaotic this has become now that people are finding out? Or do you think there's something, it's just something else entirely, just it has no significance at all?
Just as a refresher, so on August 12th, this is when the Oklahoma Court of Criminal Appeals found that the McGirt ruling does not apply retroactively, and so that's what we're referencing.
I think that some of that decision was because it actually does, burden the courts to do these. This is Oklahoma, and I think we're like really far up the ladder in terms of like indigenous, populations. And if you look at the court systems here, they're not already like super greased wheels moving really great to begin with. And then you burden this with, for the last 100 years, you've done the wrong thing. Oh no, we need to do it again. So I think that they're trying to just clerically wrap their minds around how to like handle that to some extent. And I know that if you're sitting over from the tribal perspective, there's no way in the world as you're building up to be able to handle what you used to, be set up to do. Because 100 years of not using the court system at that capacity, money goes to different places. So now we have to build it back up. And so many of the tribes are not necessarily like in some kind of mad rush to just retry all these cases either. There's been like 1,800 go through the Muskogee Creek Nation's judicial system. They have one civil judge, one family judge, and one full-time judge. That's a lot of cases, and they have one attorney general, and he has a few assistants. So I think that the reason maybe that these filings were even made in the first place to make that decision is because it's like, hold on, let's cap some of that madness, because the state of Oklahoma doesn't even know how many actual tribal citizens are in its prison. They self-identify. So how do you know which one of these people are, when you're going into the justice system and when the governor says 79,000 people are going to get out of jail, he's lying, because the justice system is self-identifying. Ask me when I'm going to prison and what my charges are going to be, and I'm going to say, whatever's less. That's who's going to try me. Then there's a lot of people just like me who may be tribal citizens, but may self-identified because they never had anything to do with their tribes and they didn't ever mark a box. And then there may be people who are sitting in prison who no one bothered to ask. And so, I didn't have my card that day. And so I just, I'm not even counted as that. So the counting of who actually is indigenous incarcerated in the state of Oklahoma right now, the data is very poor. And I think that that's why the courts are even, being asked this question, is to kind of cap off a little bit of a flooding problem.
And it doesn't even matter anyway, because if those convictions were invalid because, they were prosecuted by the state court, they're immediately handed over to the federal government. That's what happened with McGirt and Murphy. So it's again, you're trying to make an issue out of something that's a non-issue. And I'd added this. Every time you go to court, like I was saying with Governor Stitt a while ago, he wants to revisit these things and file these lawsuits. And the problem is, and what I would tell him if I was on his legal team is, you don't want to do that unless you know the answer. And when I'm deposing somebody, if I'm in court and there's a witness in front of me, I don't ask questions that I don't know the answers to. And the answers that he might get might be ones that he doesn't want to hear. And so the more you keep going to court, the more, and it already is, the body of law surrounding Indian law and tribal sovereignty, which is a good thing, it just getting more and more and more and more and more built. To keep going to court and asking questions that you don't know the answers to ahead of time, nobody can. It's not smart legally.
One of the issues I've seen that has come up is a lot of attorneys are questioning whether or not that was a good analysis on the part of the court. Because they're saying that the court is now saying that this was a procedural issue and not an issue of subject matter jurisdiction. Basically, whenever those people were prosecuted by the state, they lacked subject matter jurisdiction over that person. But now they're trying to claim it as a procedural issue, which are two different things. So I can see that there might be some issues going forward. There might be some challenges to it. We'll see.
All right, let's give our panel one more round of applause. Thank you all for being here today. We really appreciate you. I just can't thank you guys enough. This was a great conversation. I hope everybody in internet land enjoyed it as well. We will get you guys the recording and put it up on the Rose State YouTube page whenever we get the video rendered. So again, thank you guys all for being here.
Thanks for
Have a
having
great
me.
day.